The alarm chirped, a sound I'd grown to tolerate, not love. 6 a.m. Another day, another round in the Cressmont Industries grind. I swung my legs out of bed, the cool floor a stark contrast to the lingering warmth. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Elise was already gone, probably at the gym, perfecting the image. I padded to the bathroom, the familiar routine of brushing my teeth, washing my face, a mechanical start to a life that felt increasingly mechanical. Downstairs, the coffee maker gurgled, a small comfort. I poured a cup, the dark liquid a temporary jolt. Standing there, looking out the window, the city skyline stretched out, a concrete jungle I both contributed to and felt lost within. Cressmont Tower loomed in the distance, a glass and steel monument to my father-in-law's ambition, and, until recently, mine. I thought about the upcoming project, the Miller acquisition. It was a big one, a game changer. I'd poured weeks into the due diligence, the late nights, the endless spreadsheets. It was supposed to be my ticket, the thing that finally earned me a real nod, not just the perfunctory good job from Frederick. A corner office, maybe. A sense of belonging. Elise and I had talked about it briefly over dinner last week. It's important, this Miller thing, I'd said, trying to convey the weight of it, the pressure I was under. She'd nodded, her eyes more focused on her phone than on me. Just don't let it consume you, she'd replied, the words sounding rehearsed, like a line from a script. Consume me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Cressmont already consumed me. My days, my evenings, my weekends. I'd missed our anniversary dinner last year, a crucial meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. I'd sent flowers, a generic apology. She'd posted a picture of them on Instagram, a tight smile on her face, the caption a carefully crafted message of forgiveness or maybe passive aggression. I still wasn't sure. My relationship with Frederick was complicated. He was my wife's father, yes, but also my boss, my mentor, and in a way my judge. He'd hired me straight out of business school, saw potential, he'd said. I'd worked my way up, proving myself, or so I thought. But there was always a distance, a sense that I was being watched, evaluated, never quite accepted as an equal. He was a man of few words, Frederick. His face, a craggy landscape, rarely betrayed his thoughts. He communicated in clipped sentences, directives, expectations. Gratitude was a foreign language to him. I'd learned to read the subtle cues, the slight nod of approval, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when something wasn't up to his standard. I often wondered what he truly thought of me. Was I just a useful tool, a convenient extension of his empire, or did he see me as more? The question gnawed at me, a constant undercurrent of uncertainty. I wanted his respect, his approval, not just as his son-in-law, but as a professional, as a man in my own right. Elise and I, we were supposed to be a team, partners, but lately I felt like we were living separate lives, orbiting each other without ever truly connecting. Her world revolved around social events, charity galas, Instagram stories. Mine revolved around spreadsheets, deadlines, and the constant pressure to perform. I tried to bridge the gap, to talk about work, about my aspirations, but she'd often brush it aside, her attention already drifting to the next notification on her phone. I felt like I was talking to a wall, a beautifully decorated, perfectly curated wall, but a wall nonetheless. There were moments, fleeting moments, when I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with, a shared laugh, a genuine smile, a brief connection that reminded me of what we once had. But those moments were becoming increasingly rare, swallowed by the relentless tide of her ambition and the demands of her carefully constructed image. As I finished my coffee, I felt a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. It was a feeling I couldn't quite place, a sense that something was off-kilter, that the ground beneath my feet was shifting. I told myself it was just pre-meeting jitters, the pressure of the Miller acquisition. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something ominous. The meeting started like any other. The usual polite greetings, the exchange of folders, the obligatory small talk about the weather. Frederick sat at the head of the table, his expression as always unreadable. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, a mix of anticipation and a faint unease. I was ready to present the Miller acquisition, the culmination of weeks of intense work. I thought I had it nailed. "Let's get straight to it," Frederick said, his voice flat. He didn't even open the folder in front of him. My stomach dropped a little. Something in his tone, it was different. He looked directly at me, his gaze unwavering. "We're letting you go." The words hung in the air, a cold, sharp blade. I blinked, trying to process them. Letting me go? What did that even mean? I felt a rush of confusion, a desperate need to rewind, to replay the sentence in my head, to make it make sense. I I don't understand," I managed to stammer, the words catching in my throat. My carefully prepared presentation, the charts and graphs I'd spent hours perfecting, suddenly felt irrelevant, absurd. Frederick's face remained impassive. "Performance issues," he stated, the words clipped and final. No explanation, no elaboration, just those two words. A dismissal that felt like a slap in the face. Performance issues? I wanted to laugh, a bitter, hollow laugh. My mind raced, trying to grasp the accusation. The late nights, the missed weekends, the sacrifices I'd made for this company, for his company, they all evaporated, reduced to performance issues. I wanted to argue, to list my accomplishments, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. I was too stunned, too blindsided. I looked around the table at the faces of my colleagues, people I'd worked alongside for years. They avoided my gaze, their expressions a mixture of awkwardness and discomfort. No one spoke up, no one defended me. The HR manager, a woman who had always been friendly, slid a folder across the table. "Severance terms," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Confidentiality agreement, a list of restricted activities." It felt like a checklist, a cold corporate procedure, not the end of 7 years of my life. I wanted to ask Frederick why. What had I done? What had gone wrong? But the words died in my throat. His expression was a closed door, a clear signal that there was no room for discussion, no space for explanation. I felt a wave of nausea, a sickening realization that this wasn't a mistake, a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, planned. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely weak. I gathered my things, my hands shaking slightly. I couldn't meet anyone's eyes. I walked out of the conference room, the sterile white walls blurring around me. I felt like I was in a dream, a bad dream, where everything was distorted and unreal. I walked through the glass lobby, the sounds of the office fading into a muffled hum. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled environment I'd just left. The winter sun glared down, indifferent to my turmoil. I stood there for a moment, my breath misting in the air, wondering how it could all unravel so quickly, so neatly. I got into my car, the familiar scent of the leather, a small, fleeting comfort. I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind reeling. I told myself Elise would understand. She would be furious on my behalf. She would tell me that I wasn't defined by Frederick's verdict, that we would figure it out together. I replayed the conversation in my head, clinging to that hope, that lifeline. I needed her support, her reassurance. I needed to hear her say that everything would be okay. But even as I rehearsed those words, a small, nagging doubt crept into my mind, a feeling that something wasn't right, something off. The drive home was a blur. I barely remember navigating the streets, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. I kept replaying Frederick's words, performance issues, trying to find some logic, some explanation that made sense, but there was none. It was a dead end, a brick wall. I pulled into the driveway, the house looming before me. It should have been a sanctuary, a place of comfort and warmth, but tonight it felt empty, silent. There were no lights on, no welcoming glow in the windows. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I opened the front door, the click echoing in the stillness. "Elise," I called out, my voice sounding weak and uncertain, even to my own ears. No answer. The house felt cold, devoid of any presence. I walked further in, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. And then I saw them, the bags, neatly packed, lined up by the door, almost clinical, like she was preparing for a business trip, not this. My heart sank. A cold, heavy weight settled in my chest. I knew in that instant what was happening. Elise appeared from the living room, her expression blank. There was no emotion, no sadness, no regret. Just a strange detachment, like she was talking to a stranger, not her husband. I felt a wave of nausea, a sickening lurch in my gut. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask, to beg, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of those bags, by her cold, emotionless face. This couldn't be real. This had to be a nightmare. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her eyes fixed on some point beyond me. Then she reached out, her hand holding a large envelope. She pressed it into my chest, her touch brief and impersonal, like she was handing off a package. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the envelope, my fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. I pulled out the contents, my eyes scanning the pages. Divorce papers. The words jumped out at me, stark and undeniable. Divorce papers. I stared at them, my mind reeling. Divorce? How? Why? We were married. We had a life together. Or so I thought. I felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to understand, to make sense of this sudden, brutal ending. There was another letter too, a separate document. I opened it, my hands shaking even more violently now. It was about the prenuptial agreement, the clauses I hadn't even noticed her quietly amending months ago. My head swam, and then the final blow. A glossy brochure fell out of the envelope, landing on the floor with a soft thud. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the words, the pictures, a local homeless shelter. My breath hitched in my throat. I no longer need you, Elise said, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth or emotion. You're useless now, useless. The word echoed in the silent house, a cruel, final judgment. Useless. It hung in the air, a poisonous cloud, suffocating me. I stared at her, at the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, the woman I thought I knew, and in her cold, detached gaze, I saw the truth. She had never loved me at all. I was a tool, a means to an end, someone to lift her higher until I was no longer necessary. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a crushing weight on my chest. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I didn't cry. Some small, battered part of me still had enough dignity left to turn around, to walk back out the door, to keep my head held high. I left with nothing but a worn duffel bag, a few wrinkled clothes stuffed hastily inside, and a heart splintering quietly inside my chest. I didn't even look back as I closed the door behind me. What was there to see? A hollow house, empty of everything that once felt like home. The days that followed were a strange mix of numbness and a growing, unsettling curiosity. The initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a cold, hard question. Why? Why would Frederick do this? Why would Elise just walk away? Performance issues felt like a flimsy excuse, a convenient dismissal. It didn't add up. It didn't explain the finality of it all, the coldness. I started to replay conversations in my head, little things that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on a different meaning. A fleeting look between Frederick and Elise. A hushed phone call I'd overheard but dismissed. A subtle change in Elise's behavior that I'd attributed to stress. Were there signs? Had I been too blind to see them? I remembered a conversation with a colleague, Mark, a few weeks before. He'd mentioned some rumors, whispers about restructuring, about Frederick wanting to streamline things. I'd dismissed it as office gossip, but now it felt like a piece of the puzzle. I started doing some digging, discreetly, carefully. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had a feeling, a gut feeling, that there was more to this than I'd been told. I checked old emails, revisited company documents, things I'd normally just skimmed over. I was looking for a pattern, a thread, anything that could explain the suddenness of my dismissal. One evening, while going through some old files on my laptop, I stumbled upon an email chain, buried deep within a folder. It was a conversation between Frederick and Elise, discussing my role in the company. The tone, it was unsettling. They talked about me in a detached, almost clinical way, like I was a piece of equipment, not a person. They discussed my limitations, my lack of ambition, and how I was holding Elise back. Holding Elise back? The words stung. I'd always supported her, encouraged her, believed in her. How could I be holding her back? The email chain went on, revealing a plan, a strategy. They had been discussing this for weeks, maybe even months. My firing wasn't about performance, it was about removing an obstacle. I was in the way of something bigger. My mind raced. What was this something bigger? What was so important that they would betray me, both professionally and personally? The realization hit me, a cold wave of understanding washing over me. This wasn't just about a job. This was personal. This was a calculated execution, a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate me from their lives. I felt a surge of anger, a burning sense of injustice. I had been played, manipulated, used. The people I had trusted, the people I had loved, had been lying to me, deceiving me all along. The betrayal was deeper than I could have imagined. I thought about Elise's coldness, her detachment. It wasn't just indifference, it was acting. She had been playing a role, pretending to be my wife, pretending to care, while secretly plotting my downfall. The thought made my stomach churn. I spent the next few days in a daze, grappling with this new reality. The world I thought I knew had shattered, revealing a dark underbelly of deceit and manipulation. I felt lost, adrift, but also something else. A flicker of something harder, something colder. The hurt was still there, the pain of betrayal, but it was starting to be overshadowed by a growing sense of resolve. I had been wronged, deeply wronged, and I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't just walk away and pretend it didn't happen. I started to think about what I could do. How could I expose them? How could I make them pay for what they had done? The initial thoughts were vague, fueled by anger and a desire for revenge. But as the days passed, a plan began to form, a plan that was as cold and calculated as their betrayal. The days after everything were a strange kind of quiet. The initial storm of hurt and anger started to settle, leaving behind a space I hadn't really noticed before, a space that was mine. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't defined by Cressmont, by Frederick's expectations, or by Elise's carefully constructed world. I had time. Real time. Not stolen moments between deadlines, not rushed dinners where my mind was still on spreadsheets, but actual, uninterrupted time. I started to do things I hadn't done in years. I picked up my old guitar, the one gathering dust in the corner of my apartment. My fingers were clumsy at first, the chords rusty, but slowly the music started to come back. I remembered how much I loved playing, how it used to be my escape, my way of expressing myself. Somewhere along the way, I'd let it slip away, sacrificed it on the altar of ambition. Cressmont had demanded my focus, my energy, and I'd given it willingly, believing it was the path to success, to happiness. I reconnected with some old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my Cressmont years. We grabbed coffee, talked for hours, catching up on each other's lives. They were doing different things, creative things, fulfilling things, things that weren't measured in profit margins and stock options. I realized how narrow my world had become, how much I'd allowed myself to be defined by my job, by my relationship. I'd become a cog in a machine, a player in someone else's game, and I'd forgotten who I was outside of that. I started to explore new things. I took a coding class online, something I'd always been curious about, but never had the time for. It was challenging, frustrating at times, but also exhilarating. The feeling of creating something, of building something from scratch, was a rush. I discovered a hidden talent for it, a knack for problem solving, a way of thinking that resonated with me. It was like a part of my brain had been dormant, waiting to be awakened. I started to see possibilities, opportunities I'd never considered before. I also started to look back at my time at Cressmont with a different perspective. I saw the patterns, the subtle manipulations, the ways I'd been used. I realized that my lack of ambition, as Frederick and Elise had put it, wasn't a flaw. It was a choice. I had ambition, but it wasn't their kind of ambition. I didn't crave power for the sake of power or wealth for the sake of wealth. I wanted to build something meaningful, to create something that mattered, not just to the bottom line, but to people. I started to see that my years at Cressmont hadn't been a waste. I'd learned a lot about business, about people, about the way the world worked, but I'd also learned about myself, about my own strengths and weaknesses, about what I truly valued. I realized that I wasn't the person Frederick and Elise thought I was. I wasn't weak or naive or easily manipulated. I was resilient, resourceful, and capable of much more than they had ever given me credit for. Stripped of everything I thought defined me, I was finally starting to see who I truly was. And who I was wasn't someone to be underestimated. I wasn't a victim, I was a survivor, and I was ready to build something new, something on my own terms. The decision wasn't a sudden burst of anger, but a slow, deliberate settling, a cold clarity. I wasn't going to let them win, not like this. I wasn't going to disappear to become another casualty of their ambition. I was going to build something that would make them notice. The first few weeks were intense. I spent hours online researching, learning, connecting. The coding skills I'd started to develop became my weapon, my tool. I started building a website, a platform, not flashy, not attention-grabbing, but solid, functional, and secure. I reached out to some people from my past, contacts I'd made during my college years, people who weren't connected to Cressmont, people who didn't know Frederick or Elise. They were different, driven, yes, but also ethical. They believed in building something real, something sustainable, not just climbing the corporate ladder. I was honest with them to a point. I told them I was starting a new venture, that I had some ideas, some skills, and a burning desire to succeed. I didn't tell them the whole story, not yet. I wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of my motivations. They were intrigued. They saw something in me, a spark of determination, a hunger for knowledge. They agreed to help, to offer their expertise, their connections. It was a lifeline, a chance to start over, to build something on my own terms. I started small, working from my apartment, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of purpose. I invested my savings, carefully, strategically. I didn't have much, but it was enough to get started. I was meticulous, paying attention to every detail, every line of code, every business plan. I remembered the lessons I'd learned at Cressmont, the things Frederick had taught me, the things I'd observed, but I also remembered the things I'd learned about myself, about my own values, about the kind of business I wanted to build. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about proving them wrong, yes, but it was also about proving myself right. It was about showing them and myself that I was capable of much more than they had ever thought possible. I worked late into the night, the city lights twinkling outside my window. The silence was different now. It wasn't the empty silence of loneliness, but the quiet hum of focus, of creation. I was building something, brick by brick, line by line. I started to see a path forward, a vision of what I could achieve. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, challenges, moments of doubt, but I kept pushing, driven by a force I hadn't known I possessed. I learned to trust my instincts, to rely on my own judgment. I didn't need Frederick's approval or Elise's validation. I had my own compass, my own direction, and it was leading me somewhere exciting. The website started to take shape, a platform for something new. I kept the details close to my chest, a secret project, a quiet preparation. I knew what I wanted to achieve, and I knew how to get there. I was laying the foundation carefully, patiently. I was building something solid, something that would last. And when the time was right, I would reveal it to the world. The platform was taking shape. It wasn't ready for a grand unveiling, but it was functional, secure, and strategic. I designed it with a specific purpose in mind, a purpose that went beyond just building a successful business. It was about influence. I started small, reaching out to some of my old contacts, people who still worked at Cressmont, people I'd built relationships with over the years. Not the executives, not the ones in Frederick's inner circle, but the people on the ground, the ones who kept the company running. I didn't reveal my plan to them, not directly. I simply offered them opportunities, projects, ways to use their skills outside of the Cressmont grind. I framed it as a side hustle, a chance to earn extra money, to explore their passions. They were intrigued. They were talented people, often overlooked, their contributions taken for granted. They were looking for something more, something that Cressmont wasn't providing. My platform offered them that, a chance to shine, to be valued. I started to feed information to them discreetly, carefully. Market trends, industry news, things that Cressmont should have been aware of, but wasn't. I positioned myself as a valuable resource, someone who could help them navigate the changing landscape. They were grateful. They started to rely on my insights, my guidance. They didn't know where the information was coming from, not exactly, but they knew it was helping them. And that was enough. I used the platform to connect with other professionals in the industry, people who had worked with Cressmont in the past, suppliers, partners, clients. I listened to their concerns, their frustrations, the things that Cressmont was doing wrong. I started to build a network, a web of connections, all operating outside of Frederick's control. I was becoming a central hub, a source of information and opportunity, a place where people could connect and collaborate without the constraints of Cressmont's bureaucracy. I didn't try to undermine Cressmont directly, not at first. My approach was more subtle, more insidious. I was creating an alternative, a parallel structure, a place where people could thrive outside of Frederick's empire. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started to exert influence. A delayed shipment here, a missed deadline there, things that could be attributed to simple oversight, to the usual chaos of the business world. But I knew they weren't. I was pulling the strings gently, carefully, creating ripples that would eventually spread throughout Cressmont's operations. I was making them uncomfortable, making them question things. The people I was working with at Cressmont started to become more independent. They started to rely less on the company, more on my platform, on the opportunities I was providing. They were becoming less loyal. I knew it was only a matter of time before Frederick started to notice the changes, the subtle shifts in the dynamics. But by then it would be too late. The alternative would be too strong, too established. I was operating in the shadows, unseen, unheard, but everywhere. I was building a force, a network of influence that would eventually challenge Cressmont's dominance. And I was doing it all without them even knowing I was behind it. The first signs were small, almost imperceptible. A cancelled order, a delayed payment, a minor glitch in Cressmont's usually smooth operations. I heard about them through my contacts, the people I'd been quietly working with. They mentioned them in passing, as if they were just routine issues, the kind of things that happened in any large company. But I knew better. I recognized the pattern. It was the ripple effect of my actions, the subtle pressure I was applying, starting to take hold. I imagined the meetings at Cressmont, the frantic phone calls, the attempts to explain away these unexpected problems. Frederick, I knew, would be furious. He was a man who demanded control, who expected everything to run like a well-oiled machine. These disruptions, however small, would be a challenge to his authority, a crack in his carefully constructed image of invincibility. Elise, too, would be affected. Her world, built on appearances and social connections, was starting to feel less stable. The invitations to exclusive events might be a little less frequent, the compliments on her social media posts a little less enthusiastic. I pictured her trying to maintain her perfect facade, her carefully curated Instagram stories, while behind the scenes, her world was starting to unravel. It must have been unsettling, this feeling of things slipping away, of losing control. The problems at Cressmont escalated. Suppliers started demanding upfront payments, citing concerns about financial stability. Investors began asking pointed questions, requesting detailed reports, scrutinizing the numbers. A major client, a long-standing partner, terminated their contract, citing breach of agreement. It was a significant loss, one that would definitely get Frederick's attention. The whispers started, the rumors, the speculation about what was going wrong at Cressmont. I watched from a distance, through my network, through the news, through the industry grapevine. I didn't need to be there in the boardroom to feel the tension, the panic. I could sense it growing, spreading, like a dark cloud over Cressman Tower. I knew that Frederick and Elise were trying to contain the damage, to reassure everyone that everything was fine, that they were still in control, but it was becoming harder and harder to maintain that illusion. The cracks were too big, the pressure too intense. They started reaching out to people, frantically, desperately, trying to find answers, to regain control. They called old contacts, former allies, people they thought they could rely on, but many of those people were now unavailable. Some ignored their calls, others offered vague excuses, and some, the ones working with me, gave them just enough misinformation to keep them confused and off balance. It was a slow, agonizing process for them, a gradual realization that their world was crumbling. I knew that they were starting to suspect something, that they were starting to realize that this wasn't just bad luck, that there was something more going on, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. They couldn't see the unseen hand, the quiet orchestrator, pulling the strings from the shadows. The pressure was mounting, and their world was starting to crack under its weight. The image they had so carefully constructed, the power they had so ruthlessly wielded, was beginning to slip through their fingers. And I was there, watching, waiting for the final collapse. The board meeting. It was supposed to be a show of strength, a display of Frederick's unwavering control. He'd called it himself, a desperate attempt to calm the investors, to reassure them that everything was still on track. But I knew it wouldn't be. I wasn't there, of course. My presence would have been too obvious, too direct. I had a better plan, a more subtle way to deliver the final blow. I sent someone in my place, a proxy, someone they wouldn't expect. He walked into that room, a quiet man in a tailored suit, carrying a plain manila folder. He wasn't part of their usual crowd, not an executive, not a lawyer, not anyone they recognized. They probably dismissed him at first, thought he was just another auditor, another compliance officer. But when he placed those folders in front of each board member, when he spoke those simple words, "I suggest you read carefully before today's vote," the atmosphere in that room shifted. I could almost feel it, the tension, the unease, the dawning realization that something was terribly wrong. Inside those folders was everything. Proof. Evidence I'd gathered over years, meticulously, patiently. The financial irregularities, the creative accounting Frederick had used to maintain Cressmont's image of success. The contracts, the agreements, the hidden debts they'd tried to bury. There were also copies of messages, texts, and emails between Frederick and Elise, revealing, damning. They talked about me, about my supposed loyalty, about how easily they thought they had manipulated me, how Elise had played me. And then the final piece, the contracts, the real ones, notarized, legally binding, showing that key parts of Cressmont's infrastructure, the things they depended on, weren't theirs at all. They were mine. Had been mine for years. I imagined their faces, Frederick's turning pale, his hands shaking as he tried to explain, to spin the story. Elise's, the carefully constructed mask of composure, crumbling, revealing the panic beneath. It took less than an hour for their world to start collapsing. The board members, the people who had once cheered Frederick, now stared at him with disbelief, with anger, with a dawning sense of betrayal. The markets reacted almost immediately. Word spread like wildfire. Cressmont's stock, once a symbol of stability, began to plummet. Suppliers cut ties, clients demanded audits, and competitors circled, sensing weakness. My phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls, messages, from numbers I didn't recognize, desperate pleas for information, attempts to reach me, to understand what was happening. I ignored them all. Elise called, number 194. Her name flashed on the screen, a cruel reminder of the past. For a moment, a flicker of something, almost pity, passed through me, but I pushed it aside. She had made her choice. I let it ring. Her voice, I knew, would be filled with panic, with fear, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she could still reach me, still affect me. I finished my coffee, pushed the cup aside, and stood up. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds, a weak winter light. I had places to be, plans to continue. I wasn't going to waste another second on them. They had played their part. Their downfall was underway. Now it was time for me to move on, to build something better, something that would last. The dust settled eventually. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic clearing, but a slow, quiet settling, like the last leaves falling from a tree in late autumn. Cressmont Industries, it was a shadow of its former self. The empire Frederick had built, the one I had once been a part of, was crumbling. The news reports were filled with the details, the investigations, the lawsuits, the resignations. It was a mess, a tangled web of deceit and mismanagement, the kind of mess that takes years to unravel, if it ever truly does. Frederick, I didn't see him, not in person, but I heard things. Whispers. He was diminished, his reputation tarnished, his authority gone. The man who had once seemed invincible, the titan of industry, was now just a broken figure. Elise, her fall was different. It wasn't as public, as dramatic, but it was just as complete. Her carefully constructed world, the one built on image and appearances, had collapsed. The social circles she once moved in, the events she once attended, they were closed to her now. She became irrelevant, a footnote, a cautionary tale. The woman who had once craved attention, who had lived for the spotlight, now found herself in the shadows, ignored, forgotten. It was a kind of poetic justice, I suppose. As for me, I was busy. The platform I had built, the one that had started as a quiet project, had grown. It was thriving. It was connecting people, creating opportunities, building something real. It was everything Cressmont wasn't. I was working with a team now, a group of talented, passionate people who shared my vision. We were building something ethical, sustainable, something that valued people over profit. It was challenging, demanding, but also incredibly rewarding. I learned a lot from everything that happened, about people, about business, about myself. I learned that betrayal cuts deep, but it doesn't have to define you. I learned that loss can be a catalyst for growth, a chance to rebuild on stronger foundations. I realized that I wasn't driven by revenge, not anymore. What I wanted was to create, to build, to leave a positive mark on the world. And I was doing it. I was finally doing it. The anger, the hurt, it faded, not completely perhaps, but it became a distant memory, a reminder of a past I had moved beyond. I didn't need their apologies, their regrets. I didn't need their validation. I had found my own. I had built my own. I had become my own. Looking back, I can see that what happened with Frederick and Elise, as painful as it was a turning point. It forced me to confront myself, to discover my own strength, my own potential. It stripped away the illusions, the pretenses, and left me with the truth. And the truth was, I was capable of much more than I had ever imagined. I was resilient, resourceful, and